do actually turn the record button on.
Yes, this is on now. So here we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Darshan. I suffer from cluster headaches. Started probably 10 years back, so I've been living with it for a decade. After a severe bout in 2023, 2024, I decided to start my cluster headache tracking analysis app and research platform. And like any millennial with a midlife crisis, I've now decided to start a podcast. An important disclaimer before we begin, we are hosting this video for informational purposes, even though the guests are healthcare experts, preclinical research professionals. They are not here in an official capacity. Consider these opinions and not advice. If you suspect a chronic headache disorder, please consult a medical professional directly and get medical advice. Having said that, I'm super excited to have the guest today. Today, we're joined by Dr. Peter Goadsby. Dr. Goadsby is the Director of National Institute for Health Research, Wellcome Trust at the King's Clinical Research Facility, and Professor of Neurology at King's College London. His research focused particularly on the mechanism and alleviation of migraine and cluster headaches. He has been Professor of Neurology in University of California since 2007 and an honorary consultant neurologist at the Hospital for Sick Children, London since 1998. His major research interests are in the basic mechanisms of primary headache disorders such as migraine and cluster headaches in both experimental and clinical settings, and translating these insights into better management. Professor Goadsby's research redefined the biology of migraine, identifying the calcitonin's gene-related peptide, CGRP, as a central driver of the disorder. This discovery led to the development of entirely new classes of migraine-specific medicines that have already improved the lives of millions worldwide. For these contributions, he received the 2021 Brain Prize, the world's largest neuroscience award, and was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2022. And he's Australian, and now he lives in London. Welcome, Dr. Goadsby. Did I miss out anything?
No, it's very generous. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Glad to have you here. Our second guest is Dr. Andrea Carmine Belin. Dr. Carmine Belin is a senior researcher and group leader at the Department of Neuroscience, Karolinska Institute. Her research team focuses on cluster headache by identifying genetic factors and characterizing the link to circadian rhythm. Dr. Carmine Belin is the lead researcher and head of the Carmine Belin Lab. The Center for Cluster Headache includes all research at Karolinska Institute regarding cluster headaches and offers a well-integrated collaboration between research and clinical operations. She has defended a thesis on the role of genes in Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia at Karolinska Institute and became an associate professor in neuroscience in 2011. She is part of the Swedish Headache Society Board, a member of the International Headaches Genetics Consortium, and has been part of establishing the International Consortium for Cluster Headache Genetics. She is on the editorial board of members of the journal Brain Sciences and has been the guest editor of 2 special issues entitled Recent Advances and New Insights in Cluster Headache, respectively, Genetic Aspects of Primary Headache. Dr. Carmine Belin has authored more than 100 peer-reviewed publications in the field of neuroscience. Welcome, Dr. Carmine Belin. Anything I missed out here?
No, thank you. Perfect.
So glad, super excited to have you both here and extremely humbled. Now, to start off with, can you tell us about some of the work you're doing with cluster headaches?
Yes, so I have a team that has established a biobank with the biological tissue and also clinical data from cluster headache patients and controls. And we use this biobank to identify potential differences to learn more about this disorder. And at the moment, we're very interested in investigating hormonal influence on cluster headache in women. And we do this by collecting data from cluster headache patients during their like pregnancy, menopause. And our preliminary data actually showed an improvement in cluster headache during breastfeeding, but worsening during menstruation. That's something that's similar for what has been reported for migraine. That's one project we're running.
That's super interesting. Does that also cover what medications work with any adverse effects with interactions during pregnancy?
Not that we haven't looked into that, no.
Because I know that the gender differences in between males and females has been something that's changing every 10 years or so. Thank you so much. Dr. Goadsby, can you tell us about some of the work you're currently doing with cluster headaches?
From a research perspective, from the laboratory, we're interested in developing, or we've developed, and we're interested in using it to explore understanding of the disease, an experimental model. So, model of the incoming pain signal, and a model that involves some of the outgoing information, that is to say, what's called efferent information, something like eye watering, which is very prominent in cluster headache. And in modeling those two things in the experimental animal, we're able to explore, one of the things we're really pursuing is to try and understand what the targets are of medicines that we are currently available, but are not screamingly effective and have side effects. So we could understand how to develop new therapies in the laboratory. Also, the sort of cross is work that we've begun with our colleagues in Leiden, looking at the brains of previous cluster headache sufferers who've died, and the brains become available in a brain bank or donations that we've had, to try and pick up on the information we've got from human functional imaging, which gives you a sort of general location. You get a blob in the brain with imaging, and it tells you that probably, because it's a probability measure, that there's something different about that part of the brain. But from a nerve point of view, neuronal point of view, or brain point of view, although the blobs look small, it's actually a big blob given the way the brain works and the number of nerve cells there are in any part of the brain. So we're interested in looking at the actual structure of the human brain in people who've had cluster headache. We've got some clinical trial work we'd like to do to try and understand the therapies better and understand how they work, and some what's called functional imaging, so capturing the attacks as they occur and looking at the brain with these imaging techniques. And it's worthwhile saying, the other thing I'm quite interested in is actually the clinical side of cluster headache. Just as my colleague said, we're interested in what's called the phenotype, the manifestations of the disorder, to try and understand relationships of those manifestations to outcomes, to potential therapies. So we have an active clinical practice which has an important research and auditing dimension to understand what's going on.
That's super exciting. So with the imaging, if I heard you correctly, you would still get information from the imaging of people with cluster headaches even outside of attacks, or would it have to be during attacks only?
Well, there's information in both. There's the underlying question outside of attacks: is there any structural difference? Now, I know that when someone has cluster and they see a physician, neurologist, or headache specialist, or even GP, they get the history and they have nothing. Their physical examination is normal, and what you might say ordinary scanning will be normal. If there are subtle things, imaging requires many participants to be able to see even subtle structural things. So you might need to take 20, 25, 30 people and average the brain together and ask yourself, if you take a number of brains and you average them together, and you take a number of non-cluster headache brains and average them together, is there any area of the brain that stands out? And there are things that are different. So that's structural imaging. And then if you want to see what changes without structure, function, then you need to do functional imaging. And yes, that involves capturing attacks.
I understand. And if I can remember, at least here where I live, the confirmation of a diagnosis would involve an MRI to rule out secondary headache disorder. So I suppose this imaging data is available.
Yes, it is. There's unfortunately, not all imaging is done in the same strength magnet, and not all the magnets are the same, and not everyone's doing all the same sequences, so it's not as easy as it should be. But in theory, what you just said is true. I think for listeners, if they haven't had an MRI and someone's given them a confident diagnosis of a cluster, I wouldn't run away with the idea that everyone has to have an MRI. You can make an argument for that, but it's a kind of first world argument that says everyone should have an MRI. I think there are many folk in the world who've got an adequate diagnosis of cluster and they don't end up being imaged. It's a complex resource utilization question.
That's fair. Taking a step back, this is for both of you again. How did you get into cluster headache research?
Well, if I start, it was a bit of a coincidence. I was doing a project on heredity and migraine. Migraine is a very hereditary disorder, and this was more than 10 years ago. And I searched for a neurologist and headache specialist to collaborate with at the Karolinska University Hospital, because that's crucial for my work as a preclinical researcher, to have clinicians that can validate the diagnosis of study participants. And everyone recommended me to contact Dr. Elisabeth Walden-Lind.
Yeah.
And she had also been working on cluster headache since the 1980s. So I was very intrigued by this condition and I wanted to learn more. And I suggested to her that we should collaborate on migraine and cluster headache. And that's how it started.
Yeah, Elizabeth is a really first-class clinician and clinical researcher, and of course, there's been a really proud history of working on cluster headache in Sweden.
Yeah, I was very happy to get her on board, and now there are 4 more neurologists in the team. She's great.
For me, I started in headache disorders on the research side in 1981.
Wow.
And yeah, I know, I was practically a child, and I'd go to Professor Jim Lance's clinic in Sydney, who's a neurologist who had an interest in headache disorders, and a patient came along with cluster and had an attack in the clinic, because it sometimes happens during the day and sometimes happens, and when it happens, it just happens. And I was struck by how horrible it looked, to be straightforward with you. So I started doing some human clinical research on migraine, and I was absolutely struck by how devastating it seemed. And it seemed to me like something that ought to be studied. And so I've been interested ever since. It's hard if you've seen someone with cluster. If you're actually in the room, it is very hard not to be absolutely struck down by what you see, the degree of suffering that's obviously going on.
What's your take on where cluster headache research is now? What's gone well? What are the challenges?
Yeah, if I start, I think there's a bigger interest in cluster headaches just as the last years. I feel maybe because of the new treatments for migraine, there's also an increased risk for cluster headache. And my main focus has been genetics. That's something I've been very interested in. And now we have actually identified different regions in our genome that are strongly linked to cluster headache. So that's something we need to investigate further, which genes are in these regions and how could they lead to cluster headache or prevent cluster headache. Could there be new treatment targets? So that's a big step in the cluster headache field in terms of genetics right now. And also there's a lot of interest also in sex differences in cluster headache. We have looked at our Swedish cohort. And for example, we've seen that it's more common for women with cluster headache to have the chronic, more severe form of cluster headache compared to men. We can also see some different clinical characteristics. More women tend to have this symptom of ptosis compared to men in our Swedish cohort. They tend to use different kind of treatments and also report different trigger factors. More men, for example, report alcohol as a trigger factor for their attacks, while more women report sleep deficiency as a trigger for their attacks. So that's something that could hopefully help this patient population.
And just to dig in on that a little further, how does understanding the differences between genders, what does that give us? Where does it help?
I think it could help in terms of diagnosis, because I mean, cluster headache is something that is more common among men than women, but maybe there is a lot of women out there who have cluster headache but have been diagnosed with migraine instead. There is still this general knowledge you meet sometimes that, oh, women can't have cluster headache, but that's wrong. I think if we can show differences in symptoms between women and men, that could be make it easier to get the right diagnosis, because that's important to get the right diagnosis so you can get the available treatment that's out there.
That's every time I look up a paper, and this has changed over the decades, but I believe it was 6:1 predominantly male back when it was first studied, and the latest I see is still predominantly male, 1.9:1 or something. Is that in line with what you're studying? Do you think there's a further gap that needs to be reduced?
I think it could be, but every time I give a talk on cluster headache for the general public, there's always a woman approaching me after the lecture saying, oh, but this sounds exactly like my migraine. Do I have cluster headache, not migraine? So I think there are women out there that might have, maybe it's more common among women than we think.
You think there are still a lot of women out there with cluster headaches with a migraine diagnosis?
From my experience, I believe so. But maybe Dr. Goadsby has another impression.
Well, one's all captured. One in the clinical world, one's captured of who walks in the door, so to speak. So I don't like to think that my world is the entirety of the world. It overemphasizes things a little bit. I mean, one of the things that's gone well, I would say, is the broad understanding that cluster headache at its fundamentally is a disorder of the brain, the central nervous system. And that might sound like a pretty obvious or even silly thing to say. When I got into cluster headache, the predominant idea was that it had some vascular inflammation at the base of the skull, no particularly good explanation for why it should happen on any circadian, as in daily routine, or circannual, as in yearly routine, which absolutely fundamental behaviors of the disorder. It was all thought to be outside, the basic biology was outside the brain. Well, if you're looking around outside the brain for a problem that's in the brain, you're never going to get anywhere, ever. So I think that in my time, I'd say the first thing which has really been hugely useful is the broader understanding of the disease and thinking about the disease in terms of the brain, in terms of areas of the brain that influence circadian, daily or circannual, yearly, bigger picture cycling. And everyone with cluster who's listening to this will recognize there are times of the day when they typically have their attack, and that's a brain thing, clearly. So I think that's been hugely important. I'd say overarchingly, something that really holds the disease back is its relative rarity compared to migraine. Although it's as common in the UK as multiple sclerosis is, it doesn't nearly receive the attention of conditions in neurology that are as common or less common. And that's because it gets overshadowed simply by the numbers of people with migraine. And that trickles down into research funding for cluster, which is woefully inadequate, I would say, on a global basis. That said, with the efforts of people who've gotten really involved and interested, I think that we've had some big picture progress in understanding the disorder.
And just to quickly go into migraine here, because there have been, what I have noticed, big developments in terms of the anti-CGRP, of course, but GPANs, and there are now studies undergoing whether these can be applied for cluster headaches as well. I see a couple of maybe even related to diagnosis. Do you think it's a big issue that if I have cluster headaches, I have been diagnosed with migraines, but some of the medications for cluster headaches are also anti-migraine medications, that this confuses both the treating clinician and the patient and hurts with diagnosis and thereby subsequently research as well?
Yes, I do. That is a complication. I'd have to agree with you. Probably the most frustrating thing about everything, and this is to do with all primary headache disorders like migraine or like cluster, is I could tell you what the results of a clinical trial are. I can tell you what the proportion of people who respond are. I cannot tell the person who comes in and sits down in the office whether they'll respond, even to the most effective treatment. Let's take sumatriptan by injection, which is very effective for treating an acute attack of cluster headache. Not everyone responds. Now, there's a lesson in that somewhere, which as far as I know, we haven't bottomed out. Not everyone responds to oxygen, but some people respond spectacularly. I don't think the majority of people respond to these new CGRPs, but some people respond spectacularly. And I think for patients, and I have to say as a clinician, for clinicians, it's very frustrating that we can't pick the winner. We can't personalize treatment at the moment. I think that will come, but it is a current limitation that leads to the sort of things that you're talking about.
And I suppose the spontaneous remission of bouts don't help, because before I had a diagnosis, I remember my first cycle, I was still living in India, and I used to carry this big bottle of Tylenol around, and I would take God knows how many a day. And it stopped after, I think, about 3 weeks. And I attributed it to the Tylenol working. Of course, I didn't know anything about cluster headaches. How difficult does that make it for, I presume, for both of you to find people to recruit for studies, to study them during a trial, or to attribute a particular treatment to effectiveness in episodic patients?
Sorry, go on. Please.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem if you see that the cluster headache also changes, that the remission periods can be longer and shorter over the years. And that makes it difficult to try out different treatments, of course. Is it just a spontaneous remission, or is it due to the treatment?
Yeah, I struggle to use I don't like saying that the attack stopping is a bad thing.
Oh, no, sorry.
I'm tongue in cheek, of course, because while it's frustrating for me that episodic cluster headache patients go into remission, I never met a person with episodic cluster headache who didn't think it was a great idea for them to go into remission. You know, every cloud has a silver lining. It's a very big silver lining. And you're right, it affects clinical trials. It even affects, because of, I don't know, lack of willing to listen sometimes, I've seen it affect regulators. So people who decide about medicines. It's sometimes, in a classical clinical trial, as you say, you start two groups on something. One of them gets the active thing, one of them gets the so-called placebo, which doesn't have any effect, and you look at the difference. And if you do a clinical trial of trying to stop episodic cluster headache, the longer so that's the version that comes and goes and has long breaks between them. The longer the study is, the more people will just get better any rate, even on the so-called placebo, because that's the natural history of episodic cluster headache. And then you have to convince the regulator that this coming together of the active and the placebo group is normal. In fact, it's a validation of the clinical sample that you put together. So it offers many frustrations. If you're doing an acute study and you're trying again to do the same thing, if some of the folk will go into remission and they won't get to do the second part of the study, so they might have got the active part, and that's unhelpful from a clinical trial point of view. But I always, as frustrated as I get by that, I remember the big picture that cluster headache stopping, this is a good thing in principle.
Yes, I can attest to that as someone that is in remission right now.
Yeah.
You mentioned chronic headaches as well. Now, again, correct me if my numbers are wrong here, but within the cluster headache population, it is believed chronic cluster heads are about 15%, maybe 20%. What do you think is the possibility, or how is it stupid to then say let's make chronic cluster headaches a separate category, which would make it a rare disease that can unlock some benefits from research?
Yeah, yeah, it's not a stupid suggestion at all. You have to ask yourself the question, what makes a disease category? And how you define that. So not everyone with high blood pressure's got hypertension. Okay, we can agree on that. Some people have got it because of can improve it just by losing weight. Some people will take 5 antihypertensives. Do you really treat the two of those groups the same? I don't think so. That would strike me as a little bit silly. Chronic cluster headache never turns off. Effectively, the biology is more or less there. An episodic cluster headache turns off. I mean, completely turns off. I'm glad you're in remission, and you can pretty much, I guess you could do anything that would normally trigger an attack in a bout, and it doesn't make a blind bit of difference. And there's clearly some biological difference there. And if you've got a clear biological difference, it strikes me that it's reasonable to think of the two conditions as being different. If I've just given you a reasonable definition of different, I think that's a reasonable definition of different.
Which would be what one turns off and one doesn't.
Yeah, exactly.
I am curious though. It is as happy as I get. I'm also fascinated every time it turns off. Do we know anything about why it turns off in episodic?
I wish.
Exactly.
I wish. If you could bottle what turns it off or bottle something that stops turning it on, that's it. You would be literally done, because you'd be done. I think that's one of the absolute pots at the end of the rainbow.
Oh, wow. Okay. So if there are researchers listening out there, if you have ideas, if you want to collaborate with our guests, yeah, this is the pot at the end of the rainbow.
If you know what turns it on or off, you don't have to wait to talk to us. Just put it on the internet somewhere.
Switching gears a little bit about what causes them. Dr. Carmine Belin, you've also published a GWAS study implicating smoking as a causal risk factor. Was there anything else from the study? Because smoking is thought to be more of a correlating factor, but in your study, you found that it was more of a causation.
Yeah, so we performed this genome-wide association study, GWAS, and then you screen millions of genetic markers all over genome on each chromosome and compare the frequency of these variants in both patients with cluster headache and controls. And doing this, we identified changes in the frequency of these genetic markers on 8 regions when you compare cluster headache and controls. So they were linked to cluster headache. And now in this study, we're trying to characterize the genes in these regions. How are they connected to cluster headache? Can they lead to cluster headache? And in our downstream analysis, using this genetic data, we found a strong overlap with the genetic markers that we found that were linked to cluster headache. They were also linked to smoking habits. And we also did something called a Mendelian randomization. That's when you use this genetic variation to address if a modifiable exposure like cluster can influence a different outcome like cluster headache. And that's why we could see that there was a causal effect. The more smoke, you have a higher risk of developing cluster headache.
And just to understand in simple terms, so is it that I was born with a genetic component? Is it a variation, and then there are causal factors or risk factors, or how do I understand this study?
It's not that easy, unfortunately. We will never find like one genetic marker that is linked to the disease. There could be a combination of both genetic risk factors and protective factors. You can get risk factors from your mother, protective factors from your father, then you might not end up with the disease. And of course, there's a combination with the environment. So it's not that, and we know that there are smokers among cluster headache patients, but there are also non-smokers, and you rarely get better stops smoking. So we still don't know all the answers to this smoke connection to cluster headache.
And we've seen some analysis that we're doing on the real world evidence, and we've seen actually a higher percentage of non-smokers, different perception of non-drinkers, former drinkers, for example. So I guess the idea behind the questioning was a lot of us at some level feel maybe some guilt about this being a lifestyle disease. I guess I was wondering, is it related to any of that? Again, it may be a tough question, as you just said, it's a complex question to answer. But to summarize what you said, so it is a complex genetic neurological condition that can be aggravated by certain factors. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, and the fact that there are cluster headache patients that have never ever smoked, so that's not you can't like blame the cluster headache patient for smoking.
But stopping smoking does not stop the attacks.
Not for some report that, but some like say that they get worse. So it's we don't have the answer to this, but we can see that it's more common to smoke in this patient group. That's something that has been reported in cohorts worldwide. But
Yeah, I don't think that. Sorry.
Oh, just that we also in our Swedish population we saw that the cluster headache patients who smoke, they have a later age of onset compared to cluster headache patients that didn't smoke. Then some kind of self-medication before the disease sort of starts, but we can't just explain that yet.
I think we should say that no one with cluster headache should feel guilty that they've given it to themselves. That's just not on. It's a bad idea to smoke because cluster headache ruins time out of your life. So you don't want to shorten your life by smoking because you're already having your life ruined by cluster headache. So that doesn't make much sense to me. Despite the fact that cluster headache folks often feel like they just want to die, they're, as my experience, a very hardy group of people who really put up with an enormous amount and get on and try and struggle through their life and still achieve many things. They should never feel guilty about that they're inducing it for themselves. They should feel silly for smoking because it's a waste of money at some level, but they should not feel guilty about having the disorder at all.
Totally agree.
Yes. Dr. Goadsby, another question. Why does it hurt so much?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. That is a really good question because I think of these disorders, I think of cluster, and I think that's true of most of the primary headache disorders, as disorders of how the brain handles information predominantly. And there are, in the pain pathways, if you imagine that there's a maximal amount of pain that you can perceive when you turn all the so-called gates off. Imagine that you can turn on a hot water tap and you can mix it with cold, and so some of it will be hot and some of it very hot. But if you have nothing turning it down and you boil the water, then the maximum you can do is have boiling water. Okay. I'm not suggesting anyone puts that on their hands, but people with cluster will tell you that their pain is pretty much invariably, they'll tell you this is a bit of a chestnut, but I think it's, when it's been looked at, it's true. They'll tell you that it's the worst pain they've experienced. So there's some sort of, which is worthwhile just pausing. I've just glibly said that, but that's an extraordinary thing in itself, that someone has their worst pain and they have it several times a day and it wakes them up at night, and that goes on for a couple of months, once or twice a year. That's just awful when you think about it. No wonder it's such a dreadful disorder. Now, if there is a maximum pain that any brain can process, you might say, by taking the information coming in and activating maximally the pathways in the brain, then I think the reason it hurts so much is that the cluster pathways, everything is turned on for pain in this pathway, and that's why it hurts so much, because there's nothing controlling the tap. The tap is just full on boiling water, bashing out of it. In contrast to lesser forms of pain where there are reflex mechanisms. If you put, for example, if you've got pain in your right hand, for example, you can generally turn the pain down in your body by doing some other pain task. Say you put your left hand in very cold water, then you get something. There's a number of ways of doing this, and there are therapies which take advantage of it. There are pathways in the brain that turn those perceptions down. They're anti-pain pathways, if you like, anti-nociceptive pathways, as researchers would call them. I think the reason that cluster pain is so painful is because those pathways just don't function properly during an attack, whereas for other forms of head pain, those pathways are not entirely disabled. That's a very hand-waving answer, because the truth, of course the truth is that I don't know exactly, but I think that's a plausible way of thinking about why it's so bad. And they so often say it's just worse than anything else.
How is it then that the taps are turned off only on one side or turned on only on one side?
Well, the structures that are involved in this do respect the midline. You can show experimentally that there are structures in the brain that will simply reduce pain input from one side of the body or another. And you can show that in experimental animals. We understand quite a lot about what those structures are. You see that if you're doing imaging, the functional imaging and cluster, there are structures in the brain that respect the midline, that are just active on one side of the brain. The brain is a very lateralized structure. A good example of this, listeners may be familiar with, this stroke. You can have a stroke in one part of the brain that just stops, say, the right arm working, but the left arm is absolutely 100% fine and dandy, because the brain has this lateralization. It has this process of respecting sides, and that's true for outgoing things like movement, so-called motor things, and it's also true for incoming information like sensory things, so to speak, like pain, and it's true for the way those systems are controlled.
That's interesting. I do want to follow up, or maybe with an anecdote of how I was predominantly right-sided for 6 years until I got gone blocks, and it completely stopped on the right and then started on the left. But in the interest of time, there is another important topic that I wanted to cover, which is diagnosis. A lot of us in the community struggle with diagnosis, and depending on which country, who you ask, which gender, of course, it can range anywhere from a couple of months to 10 years. To maybe a two-part question, if there are listeners out there that are in the primary care level or neurologists that need an efficient way to diagnose cluster headaches, or if there are listeners that are struggling to get diagnosis, how can they advocate for the right diagnosis? How would you diagnose, or what is your process of diagnosis?
I'll give that question to Dr. Goadsby.
So you're asking what helps make the diagnosis? Is that what you're thinking?
Yes. One, what helps make the diagnosis for any of the doctor listeners out there? And second, if there is a cluster head listening and is struggling to get the diagnosis, what can they do? If someone suspects cluster headache, what can they do?
Okay, so if someone suspects they've got cluster headache, then probably, although this will sound maybe a bit weird, but it's modern and useful, is to get someone to help them and video an attack, because the behaviour of someone with cluster headache is nothing like the behaviour of someone with migraine. A person with cluster headache will be generally agitated, restless, move about, rock back and forward, rub their head, maybe say some expletives, that they're turned on, so to speak. Person with migraine is substantially is turned off, so to speak. They tend to be quiet. They'll move into a dark room. They won't run about. They won't move about because it makes things worse. So if you look at someone, not that it's just about looking, but if you start with that point, generally speaking, if you've got a video of an attack and you just let it rip when you have the attack, don't restrain yourself, then the person watching the attack you'll get their attention, and it will help with the It'll help with the diagnosis. So there's that behavioural thing, what you do, and the length of attack is quite helpful. Cluster tends to be shorter than migraine, as an example. Cluster comes with this circadian periodicity, so generally speaking, happening at the same time. Generally, it's the same for a period of time, and then it turns off in the commonest form, which, as you said, which is the 85% form, which is the episodic form. So I think once you get someone's attention to the problem or the possibility, I think doctors are pretty good at just sort of following up on that. If you're struggling yourself and wondering whether you have it or you don't, you just look it up on cluster headache. Go to the cluster headache patient group, ouchuk.org, and there are videos of people having cluster headache. Read a little bit about it. More than half of the people we see these days who do have cluster headache have worked it out just by Googling and looking at what's written and what they see on the internet. So it's a good use of modern technology.
Absolutely, and I think in the online communities as well. And again, like you said, it's a big world we live in, and sometimes it is rather hard that one of us can suspect having cluster headaches for years before a diagnosis. Moving on, possibly you've got these questions, Dr. Carmine Belin. I'll start with you. The name cluster headaches, of course, in Swedish, Sweden, where you're from, it's Hortens huvudvärk, if I'm saying it correctly. But of course, it's not called cluster headache. Do you think the name justifies the amount of pain, the challenges we go through? What would you call it if you were given a chance?
Well, yeah, good question. And as you mentioned, in Sweden, it's Horton's headache after this neurologist Bayard Horton, who described it in the 1930s. But we actually, the last years, we're moving on to use the name that the rest of the world is using, cluster headache, klusterhuvudvärk in Swedish. It's always tricky to use personal names for diseases, but in a way that's maybe more objective if you see the symptoms, the clinical characteristics change, instead of giving a name of a disease, exactly what it shows. But so in a way, I think cluster headache is a good name because it shows that they come in clusters, but of course it doesn't show the severity of the disease. But I've heard, sometimes it's called suicide headache, but I've heard a lot of patients that don't appreciate that, calling the disease that name, while some think you should call it that. I think it's very complicated on what we should call it, actually. So I don't have the perfect name for it.
If I had patients, I would probably explain to people that there is a difference between headaches and headache disorders, explain primary headache disorders, and how cluster headache is a form of trigeminal autonomous cephalgias. But let's just say I'm not patient. Dr. Goadsby, same question to you.
Yes, I've had a number of people tell me they think the name's rubbish, but on the other side of it, it does say something about the behaviour of the disorder, which means if you don't really need to know that it comes in clusters because it's called cluster headache. It says what it does, says that on the jar, so to speak. The naming problem is really around the word headache and your almost universal experience of some form of head pain. If you're a person who's never had any problem with head pain and you have the occasional head pain and you think that everything that's called head pain, headache, is just head pain, headache, then that is not very helpful. On the other, because these headache disorders are just that. They're never just about head pain. That's completely, none of the things that we're interested in are just about head pain. There are a whole range of other important things that are going on. I think that I'm not sure changing the name is as useful as developing a better understanding and better therapies. The problem lays in not being able to adequately treat everybody and adequately get the diagnosis. But the most cluster patients I've ever met would prefer to be treated properly. And if no one ever understood really what was going on, it wouldn't be the end of the universe if they had adequate treatment. That said, I've got every sympathy for if someone had a better name, again, they're welcome to contact us. The 4th edition of the International Classification of Headache Disorders, the committee is been formed and ongoingly obsesses about all things classification. I haven't heard anyone in the committee say that they've got a better name. And the other thing, of course, is that while Baynard Horton made a lot of contributions, he did not recognise the clustering. So it's a bit, life's complex.
Yeah, I believe it's still called Horton's neuralgia in some places, or it was one of the old names.
Yeah, we try to get away. The advantage of having a single naming system in the whole world is that if I use the International Classification of Headache Disorders diagnostic criteria in Sweden, I'll get the same result as if I use it in South Korea, or if I use it in Brazil or Argentina, or anywhere in Africa or Washington, DC. And that means we're all talking the same language. We may be talking a translated version of the same language, but we're all talking the same language. And I think that's incredibly useful for understanding, for communication about management and information about cluster headache. A big picture at the moment, that common language, I think that's a real contribution.
Does that work in a world that doesn't primarily speak English? I mean, I've heard, of course, Horton's would work. In French, it's algie vascular de fesse. There's cephalia salvus in Portuguese. How does that hold up if there's one name in English?
Because because there are translations of the International Classification of Headache Disorders into a range of languages. And if you go to any headache meeting anywhere in the world, they'll all be talking the same language. This classification, not just in English, but translated into other languages, I think is the common denominator, common language that clinicians use to interchange information. Now, what you might call it locally is a whole other thing, but how you understand what you're doing, how you take information that's generated in Morocco and can use it usefully in Cape Town, South Africa, is this classification. The other thing is that regulators worldwide, governments that otherwise at the moment don't agree on things. And I'm not going to say any particular governments, but everyone can think of their favourite government that doesn't agree with another government. But of all the ones you can think of, I'll bet that they all use the International Classification of Headache Disorders, even while they're sending rockets at each other, which is a great common language.
That is a good argument for a standardized name. And I do agree with you. I think the problem is around the word headache and around the people that don't understand that tell us to drink water or sleep it off.
Yeah, exactly. Take a paracetamol, acetaminophen. Yeah.
Small and, oh yeah, I had a bad headache last week too, and then here's what I did, insert XYZ.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Last question. If you had a magic wand to understand one specific thing about the disease, or any, let's say, a research fairy or a disease fairy that could help towards getting I mean, at this point, I don't want to say cure, but let's say cure for cluster headaches. What would you wish for?
For me, a better model to work with. That's something that's lacking. It's difficult with all types of headaches, finding Excel models. You have good when you do research on cancer, and animal models when you work on like Alzheimer. But that's something that's lacking. There are models, but I wish there were more and better, so we could monitor the disease and test different treatments, and even an AI model. But I think that would be something for the future. So that's something I would wish for, a perfect model to learn more about the disease.
Dr. Goadsby?
Yeah, I'm greedy, so I'm going to wish for. I wish I understood the turning on and turning off mechanism, because that would lead to a cure. I think that's true, not unreasonable. I think that cluster headache research is woefully underfunded, and I think that directing more funds at the disorder would invariably improve our understanding and ability to treat patients. So whether that was contributed to modelling, as Andreas just said, human work, whatever, the thing that the research fairy could give me is enough money to work out the answer to the how does it turn off question.
Well, any of you listeners out there, you know what can help us get closer to that cure. If you someone
I'd say, you know,
local government-
Darshan, I'd say, I'd ask the listeners just to remain optimistic. When you're in an attack, it's horrible, but there are a lot of people, not enough, but there are people like Andrea and myself who are really dedicated to improving this problem. There's a lot of us on your side, even in the darkest moments. So try and hold on to that, because we are trying to make it better.
That seems like a perfect spot to end this. Thank you both. Thank you so much. Thank you, listeners. Again, this is the first time. If you have any suggestions, if you have any feedback, if you want to suggest any others to come on the podcast, please recommend, drop comments. And yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Going to stop recording now.